"O Lord, I feel the weight so strong. My feet been dragging all day long." Post-Emancipation Virginia. When the Civil War ended in 1865, Virginia was a land of contradictions. Richmond, once the capital of the Confederacy, carried scars of battle and deep divisions between black freedom and white resistance. The Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment promised liberty. Yet, the countryside told a different story. For thousands of newly freed people, the dream of independence was quickly challenged by laws and practices meant to keep them tied to the soil. Freed men in Virginia faced black codes, rules that restricted movement, labor, and even family life. Many were forced into unfair contracts with former masters, agreements they could not read or negotiate, trapping them in cycles of poverty. Land was scarce, and opportunities in Richmond and nearby counties like Henrico and Chesterfield were limited. Some black families tried to move into cities, but others remained on plantations, believing promises of wages that rarely came. Between 1865 and 1870, white landowners adjusted to the loss of legal slavery by creating systems of hidden control. While the state appeared to move forward under Reconstruction, secret networks of exploitation continued, especially in isolated farms just a few miles outside Richmond. These years laid the foundation for a cruel reality. Slavery by another name, kept alive in silence and shadows, hidden farms and isolated plantations. Beyond Richmond's growing streets, the Virginia countryside remained a place where time seemed frozen. In 1871, farms scattered across counties like Hanover and Gland became prisons without walls. Here, black families were kept in secret, their labor stolen under the cover of distance and silence. Unlike the grand plantations of the Antebellum, these were smaller farms, often hidden from inspectors or union officials. White landowners claimed these families had agreed to stay. But the truth was harsher. Many were never allowed to leave. Their movements controlled by threats of violence. Houses were simple wooden cabins with dirt floors built behind fields or deep in the woods, far from the main roads. Children grew up believing they were bound to the land, never knowing the world beyond the farm. In Richmond, newspapers celebrated progress, but less than 20 miles away, a different story unfolded. Farmers avoided suspicion by presenting themselves as struggling landowners, while secretly holding entire families as unpaid workers. Black men plowed fields of tobacco and corn. Women cooked and cleaned for the household, and children were sent to gather firewood or care for animals, all under constant watch. These farms were places of fear and silence. No papers recorded the names of those kept there, and neighbors rarely spoke of it. Isolation was the perfect weapon. Without contact with churches, schools, or courts, families lived in bondage long after the law had declared them free. Manipulation of debt and labor. On many Virginia farms in the early 1870s, white landowners perfected a system that looked legal but was slavery in disguise. They told black families that freedom came with a price. Food, shelter, or tools were never free. Every loaf of bread, every plow borrowed, was recorded as a debt. Landowners claimed these families owed more than they could ever repay, binding them to endless labor. In counties surrounding Richmond, debt was the chain no one could see. Contracts were often written on paper full of legal words that freed people could not read. Even when promises of wages were made, the end of the year brought disappointment. The tally books always showed debts greater than earnings. Families who questioned these numbers were met with threats. Leave, and the sheriff would jail you for vagrancy. Or worse, men with whips would come at night. Children as young as 8 were told they must work to help pay the family's debt, pulling weeds in tobacco fields or carrying water under the hot Virginia sun. Women cooked in the landowner's kitchen or washed clothes for the household. yet were told their labor counted for nothing against the supposed balance owed. This manipulation was designed to erase hope. Generations of black men and women found themselves trapped in cycles of poverty that echoed the chains of slavery. On the surface, Virginia farms looked lawful, but behind the numbers and books was a system as cruel as bondage itself. Children born into captivity. By 1871, a new generation was already growing up in hidden bondage. On isolated farms near Richmond, black children were born into a life that should not have existed. Though the law declared them free at birth, in reality they inherited the captivity of their parents. They never saw a classroom, never learned to read, and never imagined a world beyond the fields where they labored. From the moment they could walk, children were given tasks. A 4-year-old might carry the small bundles of firewood. By 6, they could chase chickens or fetch water from wells. At 8 or 9, they joined adults in the fields, pulling weeds, picking vegetables, or tending to livestock. Their childhoods were not marked by play, but by the rhythm of forced labor. Landowners treated them as property, not as children. When visitors approached, these boys and girls were hidden inside cabins or told to pretend they were servants of the household. Fear silenced them. Parents, themselves trapped, could only whisper about freedom, but were powerless to change their children's fate. The absence of education was deliberate. While schools for freedmen were opening in Richmond through churches and the Freedmen's Bureau, those in secret captivity had no chance to attend. The very idea of a child learning to read was seen as a threat. Thus, entire families remained in ignorance, their stories erased before they could even be written down. In the heart of Virginia, less than a decade after emancipation, children were still being raised as slaves in all but name. The role of violence and fear. Violence was the unspoken law that kept black families trapped on Virginia farms in 1871. Even without legal ownership, landowners used fear as their strongest weapon. Whips, chains, and shotguns remained visible reminders of what could happen if someone tried to escape. Night riders, groups of armed men who patrolled the countryside, often targeted freed men who spoke of leaving. Their presence made sure that silence was the only safe choice. Families lived under constant threats. A father who questioned unfair debts might be beaten in front of his children. A mother who refused to work extra hours in the household could be locked inside a shed without food. Children were warned that disobedience would lead to punishment not just for them, but for their entire family. This system of collective suffering ensured that no one dared to resist. Local sheriffs in counties near Richmond often looked the other way. Many were former Confederates, unwilling to defend the rights of freedmen. Complaints made to authorities disappeared in silence, or worse, returned with retaliation against those who dared to speak. The law existed on paper, but justice rarely reached the fields and cabins where hidden slavery continued. Fear was more than physical pain. It was psychological control. The constant possibility of violence created a world where men, women, and children lived in submission. They learned to hide their anger, to keep their dreams unspoken, and to survive day by day under the shadow of cruelty. Richmond as a divided city. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. In the early 1870s, Richmond presented itself as a city of progress. The war was over. New businesses opened, and black churches and schools appeared in growing numbers. On Broad Street and near Shacko Bottom, freedmen gathered to build communities, attend worship, and educate their children. Newspapers printed articles celebrating emancipation and the promise of Reconstruction. But the image of freedom in the city was a fragile mask. Just beyond its borders in counties like Henrio and Hanover, farms still held families in secret bondage. While the city center spoke of opportunity, the countryside whispered of captivity. Richmond became a symbol of two Virginia, one moving toward modernity, the other clinging to the shadows of slavery. Black leaders in the city worked tirelessly to help freed families adjust. Churches organized schools and groups, like the Colored Men's Conventions, demanded civil rights. Yet, even within Richmond, racism was deeply rooted. Many white citizens refused to hire black workers for fair wages, and violence often erupted in alleys or marketplaces. The contrast was striking. In the same city where children recited lessons in freedmen's schools, just 10 or 15 miles away, other children were hidden in cabins, forced into labor without education. Richmond stood as a place of hope and hypocrisy, progress and denial. For families trapped on nearby farms, the city's lights were visible at night, but its promise remained unreachable. Richmond's divided reality reflected the larger truth of Virginia. Freedom was proclaimed, but bondage still lingered, concealed just out of sight. Whispers among the freed men. By 1871, whispers of hidden slavery traveled quietly among freed men living in and around Richmond. In black neighborhoods near Shoe Bottom or in church gatherings along Broad Street, stories circulated about families still trapped on nearby farms. These rumors were spoken in hushed voices, passed from person to person, never too loudly for fear of drawing attention from hostile ears. Some freedmen had relatives who vanished after the war, never returning to the city. Others heard accounts from peddlers or traveling preachers who visited rural counties like Gwandland or Powhatan. They described black men plowing fields under watch, women scrubbing floors in farmhouses, and children who had never been seen in schools. These accounts sounded unbelievable, yet the pain in the voices of those who told them made them impossible to ignore. Fear kept many silent. To expose such practices meant risking retaliation from powerful landowners and their allies in law enforcement. The Ku Klux Klan and other groups of night riders had already terrorized freed men communities, burning churches and attacking leaders who demanded equality. Speaking too openly about secret slavery was seen as inviting danger, not just for oneself but for the entire community. Still, whispers carried hope. Churches became safe spaces where information was shared discreetly. Leaders quietly took note, and some began planning ways to document these abuses. Though fragile and hidden, these murmurs formed the first steps toward uncovering what lay in the shadows of Virginia's countryside. Testimonies of escapes. Despite the heavy chains of fear, a few families managed to break free from secret bondage. In 1871, escapes reached black churches in Richmond, carrying stories that shocked even those who had lived through the worst years of slavery. Exhausted and malnourished, they spoke of farms where freedom was a lie and where violence kept them tied to the land. One man who fled from Hanover County told how he had been promised wages after the war. But each year his debts grew larger. He worked sunup to sundown in tobacco fields. Yet at the end of every season, he owed more than before. His wife and children were held as collateral, making escape almost impossible. When he finally reached Richmond, he begged the church elders for protection, fearing landowners would try to reclaim him. Women's testimonies revealed another cruel reality. Some described being forced to cook and clean in white households, while their own children labored outside. Others told of punishments inflicted on their children if they slowed in the fields. Tears marked their words, but relief showed in their voices as they finally spoke the truth. Church leaders listened carefully, writing down names of farms and counties, though always with caution. These testimonies were dangerous. If word spread too quickly, escapes risked being hunted down. Still, Their courage planted seeds of action. In Richmond's sacred spaces, the stories of survivors transformed whispers into undeniable evidence, pushing the truth closer to the light, growing awareness in 1871. By the year 1871, the silence surrounding hidden slavery in Virginia began to fracture. Activists, journalists, and church leaders in Richmond started to connect the whispers with the testimonies of escapees. At community gatherings, elders recounted names of families who had disappeared, and young men rode into rural counties to confirm the stories. What they found left no doubt. Slavery had not truly ended for everyone. The awareness spread slowly but steadily. Articles in local black newspapers hinted at abuses, careful not to expose too much for fear of violent backlash. In meetings of the colored men's conventions, delegates spoke about false contracts and the imprisonment of freed men under unjust vagrancy laws. Behind these words lay the reality of families trapped on farms just a few miles outside Richmond's growing neighborhoods. In churches, ministers used their sermons to remind congregations that freedom was not yet complete. They described how justice required more than laws on paper. It required vigilance and courage. Meanwhile, teachers in Freedmen schools told children to carry the truth back to their parents, encouraging them to ask questions about relatives still missing. Even sympathetic white allies began to take notice. Some Reconstruction officials heard rumors and quietly investigated, though many feared challenging powerful landowners. The year 1871 became a turning point. The moment when hidden stories could no longer be contained within whispers. The veil of secrecy was thinning, and the truth was preparing to step into the open. Historical silence and memory. Despite the awareness growing in Richmond and surrounding counties, much of the story of hidden slavery in Virginia never entered the official record. Families who lived through it often carried their memories in silence, fearing shame or retaliation. For decades, their suffering existed only in oral accounts, whispered to children and grandchildren as warnings of what the world could still do to them. In Richmond's public narrative, the city celebrated progress. Schools, churches, and businesses became symbols of black resilience. Yet behind this celebration lay the unspoken truth that freedom had not reached every cabin or field. Families who endured secret bondage often avoided public testimony, knowing that courts and officials rarely sided with them. Their stories risked being dismissed as lies or exaggerations. Generations later, descendants recalled fragments of these experiences. Her grandmother, who had worked fields without pay well into the 1870s, or an uncle who remembered hiding when visitors came to the farm. These memories, though painful, became part of the hidden heritage of Virginia's black communities. The silence was not just imposed by fear. It was also a form of survival. By keeping their suffering unrecorded, many families focused on building futures in the city, protecting their children from dwelling on a stolen past. Yet, the absence of written records created a void in history. What survived were stories passed by word of mouth. Stories that remind us that emancipation was not a single moment of freedom, but a long struggle carried in the voices of those who refused to forget.